Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to completely reframe the story of human evolution. We're not just looking at some slow, predictable march of anatomical changes here. We're talking about a wild 4 billion-year fight for survival. We are the ultimate underdogs, and honestly, the fact that we're even here today is nothing short of a miracle. To really grasp the stakes of this epic journey, we have to look at one absolutely staggering statistic: 99%. Of all the species that have ever lived on our planet, 99% of them are completely extinct. I mean, we are a massive mathematical anomaly. We didn't just casually stroll to the top of the food chain. We are the 1% that actually survived the gauntlet. So let's dive into part 1, the improbable first spark. To do this, we have to rewind the clock way back to a time when Earth wasn't a beautiful blue marble at all, but rather a chaotic, seething mass of rock and dust. 4 billion years ago, our planet was literally a lifeless, frozen yet molten hellscape. No way anything could live there, right? But then, the perfect chemical soup happened to meet a lightning strike, and boom, the very first cell was born. By 3.5 billion years ago, that single cell managed to clone itself, becoming the ancestor of every living thing today. But get this, it took 3 billion more years just to evolve the very first brain inside a tiny swimming creature. Now, perfect cloning alone wouldn't have gotten us very far. What really changed the game was a total accident. 2 early cells basically bumped into each other and merged their genetic material, which created biological sex. This was an absolutely massive turning point for us. It introduced genetic variation and random mutations, which finally allowed life to branch out from perfect clones into billions of incredibly diverse species. To put this into perspective, meet Myeloconia. That's our simple-brained, pinhead-sized ancestor. Now, take a look at its neighbor, Anomalocaris. This thing was basically the great white shark of the ancient oceans. We were completely, hilariously outmatched. But surviving that constant, terrifying threat forced a lucky roll of the genetic dice. Your jaws and teeth, they literally only exist today because our tiny ancestors had to toughen up against giant, prehistoric monsters just to stay alive. Which brings us to part 2, leaving the oceans behind. And trust me, this wasn't some peaceful, relaxing vacation to the beach. So, how do you survive when the water itself becomes a toxic, stagnant trap? Well, by 375 million years ago, we had evolved into foot-long armored fish. But our shallow waters turned into these nasty, oxygen-starved swamps. We couldn't stay, but those giant predators we just talked about meant we definitely couldn't flee back to the deep ocean either. We were totally cornered. We needed a desperate evolutionary leap. Over thousands of generations, we slowly evolved early lungs so we could gulp air above that toxic swamp. And amazingly, our ancestor Ichthyostiga developed a throat mechanism to close off its gills to breathe air. Here's a crazy fact for you. Whenever you get the hiccups today, you're actually experiencing the lingering spasms of that exact ancient gill-closing reflex. Wild, right? To survive on the actual shore, we then had to develop thicker skin to block the fierce sun, and we grew tough claws, which eventually evolved into your fingernails. Okay, so we could survive on land, but we had a huge problem. Our eggs kept drying out in the harsh sun. The solution to this was an absolute evolutionary masterpiece. Males began fertilizing eggs internally, and a tough shell formed around the embryo to seal in nutrients and moisture before it was laid. This incredible, groundbreaking innovation was what finally, permanently severed our ties to the ocean. So we're conquering the land, right? Everything's going great. But then, the board gets completely reset. Let's look at part 3, the mammalian underdog. About 250 million years ago, the Earth literally tore itself apart. A giant plume of Siberian magma surged up, covering an area the size of the United States. Noxious CO2 choked the atmosphere, trapping the sun's heat, until global temperatures soared well over 100 degrees. This was the Permian extinction. 95% of all living species perished. Our survival through this nightmare, it was nothing but pure blind luck. And the grand reward for surviving the apocalypse? Waking up as a little, furry, cat-sized creature, a Threnexodon, only to find yourself sharing the planet with a vastly superior, newly evolved neighbor, the dinosaurs. Just imagine locking eyes with a 5-foot-tall, incredibly fast, and very hungry Herrerasaurus. Yeah, we lost our top predator status immediately. So what was our defense strategy against dinosaurs? Well, we shrank down to the size of shrews and became entirely nocturnal, just hiding out in the dark. We grew insulating fur to survive the freezing nights, and when we got scared or cold, tiny muscles would puff up our hair to trap heat and make us look bigger. That is the exact same reflex that gives you goosebumps today. Plus, dodging dinosaurs in the pitch black required hyper-sharp senses, which kick-started the evolution of our neocortex, the very foundation for complex problem-solving. The dinosaurs reigned supreme for 165 million years. But then, 65 million years ago, an asteroid struck Mexico. Pulverized rock and dust blocked out the sun, plunging the Earth into a freezing darkness. Those massive giant reptiles couldn't adapt, and they starved. But our tiny, rat-like ancestor, Purgatorius, well, it survived by eating bugs off the decaying remains. The mighty fell, and the tiny scavengers officially inherited the Earth. Eventually, the dust settled and forests reclaimed the planet. Moving right along to Part 4, Stepping Out of Trees. About 60 million years ago, we moved up into the canopy to live in fruit trees, becoming primates with long arms for leaping. But over time, as those forests started to thin out, our tails actually became useless for balance. By 10 million years ago, the tail shrank away entirely, leaving us with only the coccyx bone, which is basically just a biological souvenir from our tree-leaping days. Then, 4.4 million years ago, we finally took our very first steps on two legs.
Now you might be wondering, why did we start walking in the first place? Well, tectonic plates underground pulled apart, forming the East African Rift Valley. Mountains rose up, blocked the rains, and our lush forests began to dry up and shrink. The trees were suddenly too far apart to jump between. As starving, 4-foot-tall apes, we hit a massive evolutionary dead end. We literally had no choice but to let go of the branches and drop to the ground.
And the simple act of walking upright triggered a massive biological domino effect. Sure, standing freed up our hands to gather food, but it also forced our pelvis to drastically narrow. Because of this smaller birth canal, human babies had to be born prematurely, with smaller heads just to fit through. And since infants were born completely helpless, parents were forced to stick together for years to nurture them. This completely rewired our social structure and essentially created the human family unit as we know it.
Now we reach the final rapid acceleration of our journey. Part 5, Fire, Speech, and Us.
2.3 million years ago, Homo habilis smashed rocks together to create a razor-sharp edge. This first tool was huge. It gave us access to calorie-rich bone marrow. Fast forward to 1.8 million years ago with Homo erectus, and we weren't just hiding and scavenging scraps anymore, we were actively hunting. And finally, around 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens officially emerged. Shifting from a lone scavenger to a cooperative hunter completely reshaped our bodies into endurance athletes. We developed these long torsos to stabilize ourselves while running. But honestly, our absolute secret weapon was sweat. While furry prey like gazelles would rapidly overheat in the African sun, our mostly hairless, sweating bodies allowed us to just keep jogging after them for miles until they literally collapsed from exhaustion. Capturing and mastering fire was a real game changer. Cooking meat made it incredibly easy to chew and digest. Without the need to endlessly chew tough raw roots, our heavy jaw muscles retreated and shrank. Our mouths got smaller, leaving our useless back molars trapped. Which, by the way, is exactly why so many of us have to get impacted wisdom teeth removed today. Best of all, that excess energy from cooked food went straight to our heads, growing our brains by a massive 50%. But fire did more than just cook our food. It brought us together. Extended families gathered around the fires for warmth, and living in such close quarters naturally created complex social rivalries. To survive the politics of the campfire, we had to communicate better. Natural selection favored those who could make diverse, complex sounds. Our larynx actually dropped lower into our throat, allowing us to form specific words, share ideas, and pass down knowledge from generation to generation. From a tiny, oily blob struck by lightning, to a shivering shrew dodging dinosaurs in the dark, to starving apes dropping from dying trees, we somehow survived toxic oceans and fiery global apocalypses. Armed with tools, complex speech, and a massively upgraded brain, we stopped being prey and became the masters of the world. So after beating the absolutely impossible odds of 4 billion years just to get here, what exactly will Homo sapiens do next?